Welcome back to the course of Globalization and Housing Risks of Chinese Young People. And this video is a second section. Risks and of post-18th generations. In this video, I'll introduce the social risks faced by young people who were born after 1980 and before 1989. In China, we call them post-80s, and personally, I'm one of them. First, I'll introduce the demography, education, occupation, and income of the so-called post-80s. And then I'll focus on two groups of post-80s who face extreme challenges, the rural migrant workers and the single child. Below presented are the data from the 2010 census. The total population of the post-18 group is 230 million, and among them 90% is a single child, so which means these young people are the only child of their biological parents. It might be a surprise to you, as probably you have heard from the famous one-child policy. Then you might imagine that all young people in China is only child. That's not the truth. And because only urban families who are employed by public sectors are strictly required to have only one child, and the rural families and families in some areas are allowed to have more than one child. Then 20% of them is university graduates, and 70% were born in the countryside, and 27% was born in the cities, and 44% of the post-18 generations is rural migrant workers. And one interesting thing is this unnatural sex rate of 108 boys to 100 girls, which is believed to be caused by the gender-selected abortion. Let's look at the education. The post-18 generations have experienced expansion in both basic and high education. In the beginning of the reform, enrollment of middle and high schools have actually dropped because of the high cost of education and opportunities to move to coastal areas to work. Here you can see the drop of the enrollment. And this line is the enrollment rate of primary schools. And this one is the enrollment of middle schools and this one is the high schools. And then the government increases support to poor students and also increased provision of secondary education. So from 1990s, enrollment restored to the level of 1978. So for the post-18 generation, the education they received is much better than the previous generations. And from the end of 1990s, higher education begins to expand in rapid speed, and the number of recruited students increased about 20% every year. So this line shows the percentage of high school graduates who were enrolled into universities and colleges. So it's beyond 20%, and this shows the absolute number of undergraduate students. I think personally I'm a beneficiary of this policy, and because of the enlargement, I get the chances to go to a good university. The higher enrollment rate didn't decrease competitiveness of schools, as good resources is always scarce. And you can see these high school students who have to study really hard to get into a good universities. That's almost like identical to the life I used to have, with a desk full of textbooks and practice books. In the meanwhile, as the number of university graduates increases, the job market did not increase proportionally. So the result is a depreciation of credentials. So university graduates can use to get a stable and high-paid job very easily 20 years ago, but now it's not anymore. And some university graduates cannot find a job after graduation, and that's partly because the education received in the schools was not like matched with the needs of the employers on the market very well. And along with the rising enrollment rate in general, the gap between rural and urban students becomes substantial. 80% of the urban youth holds high school or higher level diploma, but only 25% of rural youth do so. And as I have mentioned already, globalization and the opening up of many low-skill manufacturing jobs in the coastal areas attracts many students with poor family backgrounds to drop out and start working in young age. And the high cost and low immediate return further discourage rural families to send their schools to schools instead of to work. In this graph, you can see the percentage of students which continue in the middle schools, high schools, and colleges. You see in the middle school levels, the students with a rural background is still doing well, but in high schools and particularly the universities and colleges, their present is much lower compared to students with urban background. And before the reform, there is low labor market in China, and because of economic resources and social status of the individuals, well, which goes with the jobs, are managed with central planning and an administrative allocation. So upon graduation, a student will be given this piece of paper showing which employers and which work unit they should report to. And so they couldn't choose a job from the market freely. But after the reform, China merged into the global industrial divisions and commercial exchanges, and the workers can freely apply and change jobs, and the companies can freely hire the talents they believe they suit and allocate salaries they think appropriate for their talents. And salaries also becomes measurable criteria to judge the successfulness of a person. This picture shows a job fair where all the employers can set up a booth and all the graduates can submit their resumes and talk to the employers on the spot. In order to establish such a freely mobile labor market and to increase efficiency, this so-called iron rice bowl is smashed. So employment before reform is permanent, but now it all becomes employment contracts with fixed service years. And factories and companies are the ones to use unprotected contracts and low salaries to compete in the international market. And later, even for public utilities and government departments, and they will use more flexible employment contracts to improve efficiency. In this picture, you can see these laid-off workers are protesting. But in the meanwhile, many benefits provided in socialist system is cancelled to lower the cost, and the workers have to bear the expensive consumption in housing, childcare, and healthcare. Well, this which was used to covered like almost offered for free in the socialist area. I have mentioned in the first part that the average wage rose sixfold between 1978 and 2005, but the benefits are not enjoyed equally or egalitarianly. The return of education increased, but the benefits are mainly taken by youngsters who were born in the cities. The marketization of higher education knocked out those who cannot afford it, and the introduce of free labor market destroyed the stability of education investment. The latter make it hard for rural students who finished higher education but have no good social connections to find a high income jobs and return their education investment. This picture shows, like, even for these two youngsters, they might have the same educational level and skills, but because of the difference of their family backgrounds, their positions of competition are very different. And this picture shows, well, this man who used to be the richest man in China, and his sons, who's now also very successful in business. In the first part, now let's look at the rural migrant workers. So in the first part, I've mentioned that 7% of the post-18 generations were born in rural areas. So that's that's about 100 million young people. Um, and 44% of post 44% of the post-18 generations is rural migrant workers. So there is about so it's about 100 billion young people are rural migrant workers. They were born as farmers with the farmer's social status, but they hardly done any agricultural work. They go to schools in the countryside, and after graduated from middle or high schools, they go to work in the cities as a teenagers. And some of them even grow up in the cities with their migrant worker parents and eager to become a real urbanites and white-collar workers. They have high expectations on consumption and quality life, but they can hardly afford working on any preferential jobs due to their poor education, and especially because they are separated, where many of them were separated with their migrant worker parents. Some of them have like a mental issue or problems in their personalities. The global financial crisis had an impact on the as demands for export rapidly decreased. According to statistics, about 20 million migrant workers had lost their jobs in 2009, and Chinese government noticed the imbalance of export and domestic consumption, so the policies started to level out the preferential policies between foreign and export-oriented companies and local companies and products for the domestic markets. Domestic consumption slowly grows. Economic opportunity improves in inland provinces, so the migrants can find jobs in nearby cities or even local communities, so they can stay with their families. And from 2011 onward, policies start to encourage them to settle down in near home small cities and to endow public services to the migrants. There are also policies to support returned migrant workers to start businesses and to help the destitute. Birth control policies has diversified outcomes in micro level. For one thing, it reduced the number of offspring, largely in investment on existing one or two child, and particularly for girls with the absence of a male sibling, their chance to receive education and parents' attention increase. In rural area where parents need to pay bride price, the burden for families with only one son is much lower than those with families who have several sons. But on the other hand, the rigorous birth control policies make China aging very fastly and cause for a care crisis. Many families now have a 4-to-1 structure, and that means a young couple, they have to support 4 senior parents and plus 1 or 2 child. For families who lost their own child accidentally, and the census shows that there is 617,000 families has lost their only child. So these seniors have suffered for loneliness and inadequate care in old age.